It's great to be able to come to you once again for a little weekly chat. We took a little bit of time off and then the storm kind of got in the way of things, but we're back on schedule now, and I would hope that we could resume these little weekly encounters to kind of focus our thoughts and our hearts a bit on our greater spiritual purpose. Have you ever given much thought to the need to grow? The need to grow. Now, I know that sounds somewhat simplistic, and in one sense it is, but in another it is not, to grow. You know, a lot of times folks kind of just react to life as it comes along. You know, we go about the business of our day, we encounter the people who are brought into our lives, those closest to us, those we meet. We deal with what life is bringing us. And in going about the business of our lives and encountering what is before us, we simply find ourselves doing what needs to be done. But have we ever given any thought to how we do it? And this is everything that involves our life, from our physical selves, how we eat, the choices that we make, our social relationships, our psychological well-being, our spiritual well-being. Do we give much thought and credence to how we can grow in the various avenues of our lives? You know, even our relationships with one another could stand some tweaking. We don't always listen as we ought to folks who are trying to get our attention. We don't always react to people in the way that is healthiest or best. Let's face it, we all have weakness, we all have sin, we all have foibles, we have all of those barnacles that can get in the way of us living in the way that God would really want us to live. And so this whole issue of growth is important for human beings to consider. Now, as a person of faith, that's going to look a little bit differently than a person who is not coming at life with faith. So, for example, we hear a lot about self-actualization these days. We hear a lot about mindfulness. We hear a lot about becoming the best person you can be. Well, all of these are well and good to an extent, but they miss the mark of what we're really called to do as the individual God made us. You know, sometimes our attempts at self-tweaking really are more self-serving than they are anything else. They're really designed to make my life better for myself and those I care about, and not necessarily stretch me beyond my limits to something greater. And that's where faith comes in. Because one of the things that faith does for us is it stretches us. It calls us to a deeper truth. It takes the focus from here and puts it out there, so that I see myself in a more holistic, total way as God designed me. I see myself not only in terms of this life, but into the one that I am also destined to enjoy, eternity. When we bring that dimension into this whole idea of growing, we see that it takes a much different shape. It's not just about what is best for me and what serves me and what serves the needs of those around me. It's what's best for me on a much deeper level that is going to serve my more eternal, more lasting self. And so what does this look like? Well, for a person who is faithful, a person who is trying to deepen their relationship with God, growing is so incredibly important. It means that I must have a fairly decent understanding of myself. As I look at myself, I have to understand those things that I do well, my giftedness, but I also have to understand my weakness. You know, so for example, when someone confronts me with an issue or says something to me that I find unpleasant, is my first thought to become defensive? Or have I gotten myself to a place where I can truly listen to what's being said and see if there's any merit or value to it? You see, one way just simply reacts, the other one processes. And so we need to learn how to process life a little bit better if we're going to grow. But that processing of life has to be put into a context. And what is that? Well, St. John in John's Gospel gives us a little bit of a clue. And it's something that we've heard, something that we know, but it's something that we really don't ponder and consider to its depth and its entirety. He says this in the 12th chapter. He says, I solemnly assure you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. The man who loves his life loses it, while the man who hates his life in this world preserves it to life eternal. Well, those words sound a little bit different than just self-actualization, mindfulness, and becoming the best person you can be. We're directed and told that we must die, not just not only our final death, but along the way. You know, for the Christian, daily we are called to die. And that means that we need to approach things a little bit differently. We need to factor in disappointment and something else we're not very comfortable with, darkness. We're asked to die. We're asked to give up something to embrace something else, so that when I reach out, for example, to help my neighbor, I'm not doing that just for the joy of giving. I'm doing it to set my own priorities aside, to stretch myself a bit, because my faith is calling me to grow. And see, this is where faith makes such a big difference in our life. To extend myself in service to another person, in love to another person, to bring compassion to another person. You see, in our interactions with one another, compassion, mercy, forgiveness, those aren't things that humanly come easy. Those are things that we need to work at from our life of faith and build them into ourselves and grow in them. You see, so the grain of wheat that we all are is asked to die. We have to leave the familiar and move out into a new adventure. Well, we all know that really well these last several months. We've had to leave the familiar and go out into a new adventure, and we know how uncomfortable that is, because it does throw us into this place of darkness. We're still in it. We don't really see the light at the end yet, right? And it's uncomfortable, it's unnerving, it produces anxiety, and it brings us to this place of uneasiness, and as it should. It's much different than what we knew. What we knew is gone. We can't recapture that right now. And that disturbs us. And so we're in this place of darkness. We have had to die to something. And what we're going through now is a good test of where our faith is in our growth process. So here's the problem with darkness. We can't see. And so what happens when we're encountering darkness is we automatically assume that because we can't see, we don't know, then God's not in the darkness. So that somehow I've been abandoned, or I've somehow been neglected, or maybe God is not. And so we live in this time of darkness and we think we're alone. We think that there's nothing else but me in the darkness. And this time of confusion and uneasiness. You know, I'm thinking of someone who is just lost their spouse in death, feels this anxiety and this pain very acutely because they don't have a sense yet of what it is to be alone in this world. They've always been tied to this significant other who's no longer there, and it's scary. It's scary, it's dark, and that aloneness can be piercing, and we don't know where God is in all of that stuff, right? And so because we can't see God in the darkness, the tendency is to kind of just pull back from the whole God thing, which a lot of people are doing. They're pulling back from their faith. Why? What's that all about? Because we've gotten out of the habit of practicing it, we just pull back because we've realized, oh, maybe we don't need it anymore? I think we do. Now, more than ever, to rediscover ourselves as we are, as God designed us, not as the world wants us to be, but as God wants us to be. So here's something interesting. I've always referenced this classic work from many, many centuries ago called The Cloud of Unknowing. The Cloud of Unknowing. I've referenced it before, you've heard me speak of it before, but there's a very powerful paragraph in the 4th chapter of that book. And I want to just share it with you because it talks about darkness and it gets at a little bit why we have such a problem with it, okay? Do not suppose, the author tells us, that because I have spoken of darkness and of a cloud, I have in mind the clouds you see in an overcast sky, or the darkness of your house when a candle fails. If I had, you could, with a little imagination, picture the summer skies breaking through the clouds, or a clear light brightening the dark winter. But this isn't what I mean at all. So forget this sort of nonsense, he tells us. When I speak of darkness, and this is where it's important, I mean the absence of knowledge. Remember that, darkness and the absence of knowledge. If you are unable to understand something, or if you have forgotten it, are you not in the dark as regards this thing? Let me repeat that. If you are unable to understand something, or if you have forgotten it, are you not in the dark as regards this thing? You cannot see it with your mind's eye. Well, in the same way, I have not said cloud, but cloud of unknowing. For it is a darkness of unknowing that lies between you and your God. A darkness of unknowing that lies between you and your God. And that's it. This is the problem with faith right here. See, because we don't know, we assume that we're somehow out of sync with God's plan, and so that God's not in this because we need to know. We need certainty. We want to know that God is here, and A is going to lead to B, is going to lead to C, and all is going to be well at D. But see, when we're going through life and we don't know, we don't have the enlightenment of our mind's eye or a sense of what our heart desires, then we get unsettled and we think that God is absent. So it is this unknowingness. We don't know what God's plan is. God could bring us through this darkness to incredible places, which he probably will, huh? But we don't know that yet. And so because we don't know it, we don't like it. And that's the problem with darkness. And so we can scurry all around, as a lot of people do. You see, if you don't have eyes of faith, then when life gets dark, you try to seek light wherever you can find it. You try to get through that darkness as quickly as possible. And so you sometimes replace it or try to illuminate it with stuff that's not healthy, with stuff that's distracting, with stuff that's preoccupying, with stuff that may be entertaining. You see, and that's what human beings do. When life gets difficult and dark, they don't want to stay there. And so they seek to leave it as fast as possible. Find the quickest fix. Or you're suffering, relieve the suffering. You're hurting, relieve the hurt. Okay? Whereas our faith says, we are all grains of wheat and we must die. And guess what? Dying hurts sometimes. We have to leave something. And it's painful to separate from the familiar and go into the unfamiliar. It's painful to leave what I've known to go into something that I don't know. But see, the power of this book, The Cloud of Unknowing, is that we have to learn to love the darkness because God is in the darkness. You see, that cloud pierces the very presence of God. And one thing we know in a life of faith is we never can have certain knowledge of God. We're just weak mortals. Right? God is always going to be huge. And the most we can hope for is to get glimpses, little pieces, little encounters, little touches, little inspiration, little hopes. But we have to love first. You see, we have to give ourselves fully over to this cloud of unknowing, to this seemingly darkness that pervades us, because in there is the essence of who we are. Okay? So if we truly believe that we're not here randomly or by accident, that we are created in the image and likeness of God, that we are here on purpose in the flesh that we find ourselves with the personality and the soul that is within us. If we believe that God has really fashioned that and made that, then as Julian of Norwich reminds us, then we can know that God's going to sustain that, and God is going to preserve that, and all will be well. There's faith. It's not knowing the intricacies of God. It's just knowing the it of God. Okay? The essence that God is and I am. God is, I am, and that's all. And during this life, we sit with the darkness, we sit with the uncomfortability, and growth comes as that burns through us a bit, And it teaches us about ourselves, and it refines us as gold in the fire. And it hones us, and it makes us stronger. And then we see what happens is we begin to develop virtue, fortitude especially. We learn the value of prudence, of wisdom, temperance, moderation. You see, all of this begins to fall into place when we take ourselves away from ourselves a bit, accept our vocation to die, and then embark upon this wonderful journey of enlightenment, not just self-enlightenment, but God enlightenment, in which, to whatever extent God allows me, I'm able to encounter God's presence, gain the insight and wisdom to deal with whatever life brings to me, and move on with a greater sense of grace and purpose and direction. So I don't know how human beings can truly be human beings without this knowledge of themselves, because anything else is going to be off point. Everything else is going to lead to a distraction. Everything else is going to lead into error. So, to my mind, if we're going to be successful at this task of being who we are, of living in this world, and figuring out how to live life with one another on this planet, life that is based on justice, a life that is filled with peace, a life that has opportunity and blessedness, then we need to be people of faith. And our growth as human beings has to be rooted in that faith. Otherwise, we're just going to keep spinning the wheels, entertain a bunch of self-aggrandizement, put Band-Aids on wounds that really ought to be healed, and just keep stumbling over ourselves as we see that we're doing already. And so there's a lot here to consider. But doing so with faith and doing so without is going to bring a person to two very different places. And I would venture to say that sometimes it takes people a long time to wake up and realize just how unhappy they are. And they find themselves puzzled and perhaps wondering how and why they got to that point. After all, haven't they achieved all that they set out to do? But somehow it's not enough because they focus too much on themselves and haven't pondered their call to die, haven't pondered their greater selves, haven't made friends with the darkness, and haven't given themselves over in an unconditional love of the God who has made them, who sustains them, and who one day will redeem them. We need to believe. We need to trust. And we need to have a certain knowledge that no matter what happens to us, all will be well. Can we leave our anxieties and our fears and truly believe that? God bless you.